appreciate that. Carol was one of the very small group of people who agreed to read parts of the manuscript. So thank you so much for doing that. That was, the manuscript phase is when you're vulnerable. And so when you read the first part of it, that really meant a lot to me. So thank you. And thanks for having me here tonight. So yeah, we have books. We also have, I made custom bookmarks. So I think I'm as excited about the bookmarks as I am. That's the way things work. So let's see. So I should tell you a little bit about the book, I guess. I started it in the summer of 2010. I had just finished the AIA Guide to New York City, which I spent a little less than 2 years on. And that was a really arduous project. And let's see, I finished the AIA Guide in, I think in March of 2010. In April of 2010, my wife and I had our first baby. And then a couple of months later, I started this book. And so we went up to Woodstock that summer. So the origin story for this book is that we were in Woodstock with a newborn in what had been rented to us as I think they called it a cabin. It was really a shed. It was really tiny, and it was on a nice babbling brook with woods on the other side. So every other day, my wife and I would trade off the first part of the day, and the person who wasn't on baby duty would step across the stream on rocks, hike through the woods till it came to a long road, we came to a highway, down a highway, into downtown Woodstock. And we discovered that Woodstock actually has a really great library. And so every other day I would go to the Woodstock library just to kind of kill time. It turns out they had a really amazing New York City section. And so I started just kind of randomly picking out books from the shelves and started reading all about Broadway. They had all of these really old, rare books, a couple of which I kept and I need to send back to them. It was 8 years ago. I should do that. So that's kind of how it started. And I like the idea of just writing about one street rather than all 5 boroughs, which I have been doing with the AIA Guide. And the original idea was that maybe I could understand the city and in a little more focused way by just taking one slice out of the city, like one sliver, one section out of the city. That was the original idea. It turns out that it's not quite that simple, because you can't talk about any street in just one street in isolation. That's not how cities work. Cities are networks. So I found myself studying the history of every street that crosses Broadway. So I was studying about Canal Street, and 14th Street, and 42nd Street, and Dyckman Street, and on and on. And so it really became a book about the city. So that's why, hence the title. It really is about New York City. And it ended up being not just about New York City, because then as I was learning more about Broadway and the city, then I saw how that related to other cities. So then I was studying about Philadelphia, because New York had this rivalry with Philadelphia in the 18th and early 19th century. And its rivalry with Philadelphia drove a lot of its decisions. I ended up reading newspapers from El Paso and Albuquerque in the early 20th century, because those little towns tried to build a replica of Broadway. After Broadway became the Great White Way, all these little towns had to have their own version. So I was studying all of American history, and then even started going further than that, because I got really interested in the economy that was driving Broadway. So I found myself studying the corn laws of the 18th century and flour exporting and all of these things, and reading newspapers in England, and studying trade routes to China. So the whole thing kind of got bigger and bigger. So, but it's still, the conceit is that it's a focused walk, so-called, from right down here at the Battery all the way up to Inwood. So it's 13 miles in total. And originally it was going to be kind of a first-person travelogue, kind of like a Bill Bryson type of book. I'm walking up Broadway, and it would be kind of, I meet funny people and stuff. And I thought of doing it that way because, honestly, as an architect, I don't really have a lot of confidence writing about history. Writing history. Sorry, my historian friends say it's writing history, not writing about history. And I found that as I got more confident in my research, it kind of turned into more of a traditional history. And I lost the first person, but it still has this kind of vestige of a walk, and hence that's why it's divided into miles. So there's a lot of different things in the book. There's a lot about theaters, obviously, and all the theatrical types. A lot about people like George M. Cohan and David Belasco, people like that. There's a lot about electricity and how that all worked. But today I'm going to talk about short buildings. No, I'm going to talk about skyscrapers. But I wanted to start here in 1820. So I'm not going to start in the Dutch era because Broadway started as a Dutch street in the 1600s, and it gradually grew, and in growing, it stitched itself to other colonial highways and streets. And so modern Broadway is really kind of a stitching together of many different streets. But I'm going to skip ahead a little bit to 1820 and start there with this tiny little building at the corner of Broadway and Murray Street. So this is right across from City Hall Park. So this is the situation, 1820, this is 5 years before the Erie Canal happens, and that great boom in population and construction. And this is a little drugstore, and a couple of things that I want you to see here is that there's a pig in the foreground. So Broadway and other streets were known for their pigs running amok on the street. They were completely uncontrolled. And there was no water supply or sewer at this point, so here's a gal pumping from a pump, sidewalk. And what's not shown here is there are tons of horses at this point. But this is a little drugstore, and it's typical of business at this point that probably the owner, Levy here, whoever that was, probably lived upstairs or maybe behind. And that was kind of typical that they would have a shop on the ground floor and then they would live above or behind. And so the economy of Broadway at this point is very local. Things are coming in by ship and being unloaded directly into these little stores. But it's a very kind of localized economy. So then 1846 is an important date because both Trinity Church and this one, Grace Church, are both finished that same year. And also this building, which is the A.T. Stewart and Company store, which is still there at the corner of Broadway and Chambers Street. Today it's the Department of Buildings. So these three buildings were finished in 1846. And Trinity Church for years, until the 1890s, was the tallest building in the city. And for its time, it was really tall. It's 284 feet from curb to spire. And when it was under construction, as soon as the tower was built, this became a great tourist attraction. People would climb up ladders to try to get to the top and look out at this unprecedented view, 284 feet above the street. Can't imagine that. Everything else is very, very low. The interesting thing about this drawing, this is by the architect Richard Upjohn, and he has edited out everything around it. So Broadway is actually, you would never know that this is right at Broadway and Wall Street, but Broadway is right there. But he's decided to show that as a nice velvety lawn surrounded by a thicket here. And what he's trying to do really is emulate Augustus Pugin, the great Gothic revivalist, who he copied. This was a virtual copy of Pugin's ideal church. And Pugin showed the ideal church in a pastoral setting, so that's what Upjohn wanted to do. But of course that wasn't true at all. It was right at the corner of Broadway and Wall Street, right in the thick of it. So Grace Church is exactly 1 mile north of Trinity at the corner of 10th Street, Broadway and 10th Street. And both churches are still there today. And if you get a clear day, you can stand in the front of Trinity and you can look north and you will see the spire of Grace Church. So they were both finished within months of each other in 1846, and Grace is by the great Gothic revivalist James Renwick, Jr. And this was built on his uncle's property. That's why he got the commission, right? So those two churches and other churches were the skyscrapers of their day, and the Stuart store was as well, which is hard to imagine because it's only 5 stories high. But when this was built, people were talking about this as a tall building. So this view is now 2 years after. This is 1848. One of my favorite panoramic views of New York. Really should have been in my book. It's not. Should have been. It got edited out, which I really regret. But I really love this image. It's taken, not taken, but depicting. It's supposed to be from the spire of St. Paul's Chapel. So you can see the roof of St. Paul's in the foreground. It's looking south to Trinity Church. Here's Upjohn's Trinity Church. So you can see how much taller that was than everything else around it. And all these buildings here, I mean, this one is 3 stories, this one is 4 stories. Here's a little 2-story building at the corner of Broadway and Fulton Street. This is Fulton Street. This intersection was one of the busiest in the city throughout the 19th century. The Fulton Ferry was docking right there and sending all these wagons up here in the morning, and they would get hopelessly tangled on Broadway. But everything is really pretty short. This is Matthew Brady's photo gallery, the famous photographer. And then over here, you can see this 5-story building, pretty tall for the time, is Burnham's American Museum, right across the street, right across Broadway from St. Paul. So you have the sacred and the profane kind of facing each other. And Burnham made sure to always say in his ads how tall the building was. That you could go up there was a roof terrace, you could go up there and see the view and have a glass of lemonade. At 5 stories, I mean, that's hardly anything by today's standards. So that's looking south on Broadway, and then this is a year later looking the other direction towards St. Paul's, which is this spire in the distance here, and this is the Spire of Trinity. So it's a hypothetical view if you were floating above Trinity, I guess. But you can see that everything is pretty short. Even in the distance, you can see City Hall Park here, and even I think you can see City Hall Park poking up above. But at that point, the tall buildings were all churches. So this is 1853, and this is if you're in City Hall Park, looking west across the street to the other side of Broadway. So this is the kind of typical streetscape of the 1850s. So the American Hotel here on the corner, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 stories now. So you're starting to see 6-story buildings, 7-story buildings, even some 8-story buildings. But they're pretty limited because even if they could build taller, commercial buildings would have a hard time convincing people to climb up 8 stories to go to offices. So this is the American Hotel, and this is the kind of things that were on Broadway at that point. An umbrella factory here, a bank on the corner, a daguerreotype studio. There were tons of those on Broadway at that point. And this is a clothing factory, the William Jennings clothing factory right here, this pink building. The 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 stories as well. So the year after this, 1854, the Jennings clothing factory burned down in a disastrous fire. And something like a dozen firefighters were killed. And they made a lot of this. There was an investigation into why this happened. They started to try to put out the fire, and the building just collapsed. So there were a lot of investigations. It turns out that there was no party wall here whatsoever. There were beams and interior walls, but they just connected the beams to the American Hotel and didn't bother to build a wall. There was no party wall here either. They just built this wall down onto the rooftop of the daguerreotype studio. It's the most shoddy construction you can imagine. And so, so no wonder it fell down once it caught fire. So they made a lot of that. in the press. So the 1850s, what you start getting then, partially in response to the Jennings fire and other fires, is iron construction. So this is a view now in 1857. This is looking south from Prince Street. So now we're in Broadway's second mile. And we're looking south to Spring Street. Spring Street is right here. This is the Prescott House Hotel, one of the fanciest hotels of that era. Right across the street is the St. Nicholas Hotel, another really deluxe hotel of that era. And the Prescott was 6 stories. And the St. Nicholas, part of it was 5, part of it was 6. And then what they're showing here is the life of the street. This is in winter. The omnibus lines would bring out their sleighs, and they would turn into sleighs, and they would go up and down the street. You can see some volunteer firemen here out on a call with their fire engine. And then, most interesting to me is that on the far left side here, this building that's going up here is a cast iron building. So this is one of the buildings that today comprises Soho. And Soho is known for its cast iron buildings, but in the 1850s, a guy named Daniel Badger built hundreds of these buildings all over the city. Over 100 buildings, cast iron buildings, just on Broadway, Badger built. So Broadway really became like this corridor of iron architecture. The great advantage was that they could assemble the component parts really rapidly. Instead of taking months to build a building, it would take only a few weeks. They would make the components in a factory, rush them to the site, and then they just had to be bolted together on site. So that's what these guys are doing in this image here. And they thought that these buildings were fireproof. It turns out they weren't really. They were relative to like wooden buildings, but they weren't actually fireproof. The Chicago fire of 1871, that's when they realized that these buildings would fail when subjected to heat. So they weren't fireproof, but they thought they were. And then around the same time period, there are 2 inventions that really lay the groundwork, so-called, for the skyscraper revolution. And one of them is the invention of the Otis safety elevator by Elijah Otis in 1852. And 2 years later, he comes to the New York City World's Fair, which was held at the Crystal Palace. And he demonstrates the safety elevator by getting a platform raised up into the rafters of the Crystal Palace, and then he orders an assistant to cut the cables. And the platform catches because of his safety brake. And he takes a bow with his top hat. And at that point, then, people started to install Otis safety elevators. But the buildings, structurally, were still limited to 5, 6, 7 stories. Around the same time, 1856, Henry Bessemer, a British engineer, comes up with the so-called Bessemer process. And this involves forcing oxygen through molten iron to take out the impurities. And this allowed for very efficient, relatively low-cost manufacturing of steel. So those are the two big factors. The elevator would allow people to get up above, say, 7 or 8 stories, and steel would allow buildings to climb higher than 6 or 7, 8 stories. Okay, Carol, you're going to have to help me with this. So this is the state of skyscraper architecture in 1875, right?
Yes.
Okay. This is the, sometimes considered the first skyscraper. This is on Park Road, just opposite Broadway, right by City Hall Park. And this is the New York Tribune building by Richard Morris Hunt. And this is 1875. And then eventually it looked like this. 20, 30 years later, it was extended, so it got even taller. But this is the original one. And this is a load-bearing building, meaning that the walls are carrying all the weight. So in order to do that, the walls have to get very thick at the ground. And this works, but if you go much taller than this, the walls are going to turn into a fort. And therefore, you have less rentable area, and so they're not as commercially viable. So this is 1875. So the same year, people start to worry about this. What is this going to do to the city? This is a cartoonist named Saul Bellew, and he drew this cartoon of poor Trinity Church being squeezed in the future, he imagines, by taller buildings. And Trinity looks so unhappy. So that's the future that he imagined. But things happen pretty slowly. This is 1885. This is the Western Union Telegraph building here on Broadway. That was one of the early skyscrapers by George B. Post, great architect. And that was built in 1875. But you can see that, you know, other than that and a few other taller buildings, things are still pretty low to the ground. 5, 6, 7 stories. That's 1885. And then we start to get into the 1880s, we start to see really drastically tall buildings. What had happened is that the elevator, Otis's elevator, caught on right away. But the Bessemer process took decades to perfect. The technology was there, but people didn't really know how to apply it. In fact, Bessemer himself had to step in, I think it was in Sheffield, and kind of start to manufacture steel himself. But it was something that was very complicated technologically, took a lot of trial and error. So it's not like skyscrapers started to happen right after the Bessemer process was invented. But by the 1880s, you start to see really tall, for their time, tall iron frame and steel frame buildings. And this is at Bowling Green, right around the corner from us. And on the left here is the Washington Building. And this was built beginning in 1882 by Cyrus Field, who was all but forgotten now, but he was the guy who laid the Atlantic cable for the first time in the 1850s. And he was a railroad tycoon, banking tycoon. And he decided to get into construction, and he built the Washington Building right across the street from the Produce Exchange, which you can see over here, which was by George B. Post. So this is number 1 Broadway and number 2 Broadway. What you can't see here is that this steps back and there's a taller tower. So these were built at the same time. They were kind of competing with each other to see who could build the tallest. Field kept insisting that his architect build higher and higher. So the original roof line was right here. And then this is another addition, this is another addition. This all happened really fast. And I'm not sure if it's true, but I imagine Field kind of looking across the street and telling him, build another few flat floors. And they added this cupola at the top, which was an observation deck. So people could go up here, this is all glass here, and they could look out at the harbor. So this is fulfilling the same role that Trinity had fulfilled 40 years earlier. It became a tourist attraction. And in my book, I quote this wonderful quote that I found from Field himself. When he was late in his life, he would love to go here up to his observation deck and look out at the harbor. And then right behind it here is the Bowling Green offices from 1898. So 1898, now we're seeing something that looks kind of like a modern skyscraper. It's pretty damn tall. And then here we get the early version of the Standard Oil building here at 26 Broadway. So at this point, even though there's still a lot of pretty short buildings, you can see that Broadway's already beginning to turn into this canyon. And then the skyscrapers kind of they kind of germinated at Bowling Green and also at Park Row. But they didn't just kind of march north. It was kind of in fits and starts. Most of the skyscrapers were downtown. That you'll know that if you saw the wonderful 10 and taller exhibit here last year. Those wonderful maps. But there were outliers. So there were tall buildings, lots of short buildings, and then there would be a tall building. There was the Decker building at Union Square. And then there was this building at the corner of 23rd and Broadway, right where it crashes into Fifth Avenue. And that intersection, which is a triangle, was called the Flatiron well before this building was built there. It was called the Flatiron because of its shape. So even when it was a vacant lot, people referred to it as the Flatiron. And this architect, yet another guy with a handlebar mustache, Daniel Burnham, is a Chicago architect who's asked to come to New York, and this is his first big commission in the city. He had been famous for the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, the famous White City, the Columbian Exposition that really popularized the Beaux-Arts neoclassical aesthetic that kind of took over the world for a while. So this is his first big commission, and so he's doing the same thing, this trademark. He's trying to, but it's a really problematic site. And here you can see that it's really a modern building. This is a steel frame, and it's really, really strong. And the basement is really, really deep, and it's not going anywhere. And then Burnham comes in and clads it with brick and terracotta and limestone so that it gradually looks more and more like one of the World's Fair buildings. And it becomes a neoclassical palazzo, but a really, really weird one because of its site. And as it was going up, people didn't know what to think. And in the press, they called it the Freak. And they referred to it as the Freak, just like, so we were down at the Freak the other day, and everybody knew what that meant. The Freak building. And they were worried that it was going to blow down. It was going to blow over in the first storm. How could a building be this thin? Well, they were not catching on that this was a new era of technology where you could build something that was really thin out of steel, and it would stay now for well over 100 years and be just fine. But even today, I mean, it looks so precarious. It's so thin on the lead edge. Even before it was finished, they were calling the tip of the Flatiron the prow. And that these nautical illusions began immediately. They saw it as like a ship, an ocean liner. And it does have that kind of feeling like it's plowing its way north up Broadway. And everything else around it was really short. So this was not kind of a gradual progression of buildings getting taller. Broadway's first mile was beginning to develop, a few on Union Square, but then you have to jump ahead to 23rd Street to find another one. And as soon as it was finished, this became, without question, the most popular building in the city. It became a tourist attraction. I found postcards saying, "Meet me at the Flatiron, meet me at the Flatiron." It was such a recognizable landmark. Everybody knew where it was, and so you could meet somebody there. Everybody had to see this building when they came to the city. I read an account of Chief Joseph coming here, and he had to go see the Flatiron. Everybody had to see it. And soon after it was finished, hurricane-force winds hit the city. It didn't blow down. Everybody predicted it would. This is a famous image looking through the snow, and you can see how it looks like it's on the move. It's crossing the Atlantic. And this is one of many, many stereoscopic views that were published of the Flatiron. And you can see that everything else around it is really short. So one thing that is a bit of a mystery to me I wanted to talk about. I'm afraid I haven't resolved, but we can talk about it. Right away, people noticed that the winds were doing really weird things around the Flatiron building. They called it the Hurricane Corner, the home of the winds. Songs were written about it, poems. And I don't think they were exaggerating. They described newspapers, stacks of newspapers just flying away at people's hats, umbrellas being turned inside out. And it seemed abnormally windy. Obvious reason is that its shape was so odd, and it was just extruded from the base, that its shape with Broadway hitting, crashing to Fifth Avenue, created this vortex of wind. These wind shears that would ride down the facade of the building and then hit 23rd Street. And I read an account of a 12-year-old boy being blown into the street. And he was run over by a bus and killed. And people saw it. He was blown. I mean, so it was like a wind tunnel. And what happened was that men started gathering in front of the Flatiron because women rounding the prow of the building, their, Marilyn Monroe style, their skirts would lift up. And this became this thing. And men started just gathering there every day. They called it rubbernecking. And Broadway at this point had a special police force dedicated just to Broadway called the Broadway Squad. The Broadway Squad had to step in and disperse the men. The crowds were so big. And this went on and on and on. The painter John Sloan lived right around the corner, and I've read his diary, and he said, I was in Madison Square Park the other day, and the wind was blowing, and I saw women's ankles. And this is, I guess, a famous postcard, right? Pretty well-known postcard of this guy leering at this woman's ankles. Reading these newspaper accounts of it just made me really uncomfortable. And the Flatiron Girl, so-called, became this Broadway type. And here you can see that they're advising women on how to hold their dresses here, to clamp their skirts around their waist. Here you can see women doing that as they're walking around the Flatiron and holding onto their hats with one hand and their skirts with the other.
Is this when 23 Skidoo?
Yeah, so the whole thing about 23 Skidoo, the legend is that because it was on 23rd Street that expression was something that cops would yell at people to disperse the crowd. Makes a lot of sense. I don't know if it's true or not. But it does make a lot of sense. So the very same page in the newspaper, this is the Evening World, right underneath this image was this article. It's a longer article, How to Make the Business Girl Graceful. So I wrote about this in my book. I wrote about this phenomenon of the men watching the women, but there's another aspect to this that I've only recently realized, and I guess that's the way how books work, right? You write it, but then a month later you realize what you should have written. So the other aspect, which I missed until now, is that these women who were walking past the Flatiron weren't just shopping; they were working. They were working in these skyscrapers. So for the first time, men were working in an office environment with women. And I think that this whole rubbernecking phenomenon of watching the women was a response to this, that the city was dealing with the so-called business girl for the first time as a character, as a type. And I think with articles like this is how a woman working in an office can try to be graceful. I mean, good God. So I think what was happening at the Flatiron Building was kind of the street version of this. Like the office harassment brought down to street level. I think that's what was going on. I think they were trying to put women who were working in these offices in their place by hooting at them in front of the Flatiron. So that was 1903. The Flatiron Building was finished, and then this is the last skyscraper I'm going to show you. This is Cass Gilbert, Minnesota architect. And this is the building that he designed, and it starts rising out of the ground at Broadway and Barclay Street. And this is Broadway right here. This is looking down from the top of the post office, which has since been demolished. And so here you can see the steel building, this modern technology rising out of a very complicated site. Geologically, the site was very complex. There were boulders and quicksand boulders. And you can see how straightforward it is. It's beams and columns, steel beams and columns rising into the air. But again, It has to be clad in a traditional vocabulary. And here you can see the terracotta being applied to the facade even before it's finished. And then here it is finished in 1913. The Woolworth Building is a thoroughly modern building, really the culmination of the skyscraper revolution, but yet it's has to mimic the revival periods of the 19th century. So it's still really a 19th century building, even though this is almost now World War I. So here it is. This is what it's really copying, is the Gothic revival arches of the Brooklyn Bridge. And so just like the Flatiron Building, the Woolworth Building becomes something else. It's really a Gothic revival building. And not for nothing, they nicknamed it the Cathedral of Commerce. So it owes a lot. It owes as much to Trinity Church, I guess, as it does to the Brooklyn Bridge. And this is really what the Woolworth Building was about. This is the era of the great ocean liners, the White Star Line, the Cunard Line. And this is when they were each ship was breaking a new transatlantic speed record practically every week. This was the height of technology at that point. And so the Woolworth Building really was trying to capitalize on that. This was an image that they used for marketing. It's pretty obvious what they're comparing it to, right? That this is the Woolworth Building is like an ocean liner. In other words, the most technologically advanced thing that they can imagine. I found another image which I didn't bring of. It's the same image, but the ocean liner is on Broadway. Actually. And then here you can see what impact this had on the city. I mean, what would this have been like? Because most of the buildings at this point were still from the early 19th century, mid-19th century. They were still 4 or 5 stories tall. But then you have these monsters rising on the horizon, right towering over these old buildings. And that first image I showed you from 1848, looking south on Broadway, that was from the spire of St. Paul's Chapel. Well, look how tiny St. Paul's looks now. The Woolworth Building is there, and then behind it, the Park Row Building and the other skyscrapers. Looks like a little toy. And the whole relationship, beginning of the 19th century, end of the 19th century, into the 20th century, completely flips around. So Trinity Church is now a tiny building, whereas it should be the tallest building. It's exactly what Saul Bellew, the cartoonist, was afraid of. Now Trinity Church is just completely surrounded by skyscrapers. Trinity was built originally in the 1600s at the top of a hill. It was built there because of the view. It was an object on a hill. Now it's an object within a kind of urban room. If you go there and you walk around Trinity Churchyard, it feels like you're inside because you're completely surrounded by skyscrapers. And in Broadway's first mile, this is 1900, just becomes this kind of continuous wall of tall buildings. And they were there, of course, because people were there. So there was a demand for them. There was a demand for office space. And that's the reason they were there. That was what was driving the technology, really. And so all of these people were coming in, more and more and more people every day, every year, into these tall buildings. I spent a lot of time dissecting city directories from the 19th century. And I would look at, say, a city directory from 1800, and it was really easy and very quick to get a sense of who lived where and who worked where, because I could do a search for Broadway addresses and then put them in order. Number 1 Broadway, number 2 Broadway, number 3 Broadway. And there would be 3 people in number 1 Broadway, and there would be 5 people in number 2 Broadway, et cetera, et cetera. And then by the early 20th century, then I was looking in phone directories, and there would be like 30,000 people in one building. So the population, not only of the city, but of Broadway, just skyrocketed. And they were now living a completely different life that they had been than people had been a century earlier, or even a generation earlier. They were now living above the street, working above the street, rather. And it must have been really weird for them, for that first generation. I mean, it's weird now. I worked in some skyscrapers, and it was weird. It was very strange to be that far away from the street all day, and to look across, say, a shaftway and see someone else there who I didn't know, who I see every day. There's a great short story about that by Sinclair Lewis called Moths in the Arclight. It's a short story from like 1920 where a guy, he was a vice president of an elevator company, of course, falls in love with a woman working across Broadway in an office. He doesn't know her, doesn't know her name, but falls in love with her. So the last thing I wanted to talk about is something that happened because of all these skyscrapers, and that's the ticker tape parade. So I start the book with ticker tape parades because I felt like if I were to buy a book about Broadway, the first thing I would want to know is about ticker tape parades. So the book is not chronological. I start with that, and then it moves back and forth in time. So I started with ticker tape parades because they're just, I think, the most miraculous thing, public thing that I've ever experienced. I don't know if any of you have been to ticker tape parades, but I went to one in 2008, and I was positioned right in front of Trinity Church, the corner of Broadway and Wall Street, and I got there early, so I was crushed almost to death by people coming up from Wall Street, to the point where I had no choice. I had to stay for the whole thing because I couldn't move. It got so crowded I couldn't raise my arms, which sounds horrifying, but everybody just kind of surrendered to it, and everybody was happy. So it was okay. Like, nobody was being a crank about it. And it was just hours, and I was just in this seething mass of millions of people. And it was for the Giants, whatever, football team. But it was just such an amazing spectacle. The rector of Trinity Church set up an altar on Broadway. This is like, you couldn't write this stuff. And as the Giants came by, he had incense and he was blessing them. It was so weird. The whole thing was so weird, but so wonderful. And but the history of ticker tape parades is really surprising. As I found out, it was never something that was anyone's idea. As often happens in cities, it was an accident. It just happened. It was in 1886, and they had a procession commemorating the dedication of the Statue of Liberty. So they paraded, I think, from Madison Square down to the Battery, and then all the VIPs got in boats to go out to the island. Everyone else on the parade was left behind, so they didn't know what to do. So a group of firemen, City College students, which I'm very proud of, and Columbia students, marched down the hill on Wall Street. And they were making a lot of noise, and so Wall Street was full of offices that had the ticker tape machines. And so someone started throwing ticker tape down at them as a prank, because they were making noise, as a prank. And this was just mentioned in the press the next day as kind of this novelty. And for years after that, they would have a procession and people would throw ticker tape. But for the next 20 years, it was considered a sacrilege to do this to a parade. And there was all these letters to the editors, like, ticker tape is destroying our reputation. People come here and they're having ticker tape thrown on them. It's awful. But gradually it became accepted, and it became this wonderful tradition, and it was permitted, and it shifts from Wall Street to Broadway. And of course, you need skyscrapers for ticker tape because you've got to throw it. It doesn't work to throw it from one story. the higher the better. And at first it was these wonderful streams of confetti because it was a ticker tape, so it was a continuous roll of paper. So I would give anything to see that. That must have been amazing. One continuous roll coming down 20 stories or more. So the nature of them gradually changed. But so I was interested in that, and then I was surprised to find out that this history of parades on Broadway went back all the way to the Dutch era. So well before ticker tape, they were having processions on Broadway. This is a torchlight fireman's procession at night going up Broadway in 1858. This is also 1858. This is the Cable Carnival, which was this procession commemorating Cyrus Field and the laying of the transatlantic cable. And then there were also funeral processions. This is Lincoln's funeral procession leaving Union Square, heading to Union Square. And it looped around and went back to City Hall. So there were funeral processions for Henry Clay, William Henry Harrison, Daniel Webster, et cetera, et cetera. And there were these huge celebrations, all the time. Opening of the Erie Canal, opening of the Croton Aqueduct, Columbus Day, Evacuation Day. Every other day it seemed like there was a parade on Broadway. And they didn't just go like they do now from Bowling Green to City Hall Park. They would go up to Madison Square, up to Union Square, and then loop down the Bowery, and then go over to Greenwich Street. The whole city. Anyway, so this is Lincoln's funeral, and this is right at 14th and Broadway. This is Cornelius Roosevelt's house. And he was an importer of plate glass. And there are two children in the second-story window watching the parade, and there's the theory that one of them is the 6-year-old Teddy Roosevelt, which I'm just going to go with because I want that to be true. I love the idea that Teddy Roosevelt somehow connected with Lincoln. And this is Thomas Edison in 1884 on a campaign parade for James G. Blaine, Republican nominee. Edison took full advantage. This is when he was trying to get a contract for his incandescent light, and he got his employees to dress up with light bulbs on their heads, and they paraded up Broadway with electric lights. And this is 1892, a Columbus Day parade at Union Square. And then, now we get back to ticker tape. And ticker tape parades used to happen all the time on Broadway. I made a list of all the ones in the 20s that were like average every 6 weeks or something. There would be a ticker tape parade. Now you're lucky if you get one, once every 5 years or something. And you could see, just incredible. And this is later, and so the ticker tape itself went from the single spools of ticker tape to, at this point, I think this is the 1960s, you can see their computer punch cards on the windowsill. This is Admiral Byrd, I think. This is the Charles Lindbergh celebration, 1927. Here's Amelia Earhart, her second ticker tape parade. She got two, 1928 and 1934. This is 1934. I love this image. Doesn't she look happy?
Yeah. And it's actually ticker tape there.
And it's ticker tape, yeah. It's so cool. This is 1960. This is when he was campaigning, and then Nixon got his own parade. So they did equal billing. Anyway, that's all I got for you. Any questions? Yes, Mike.
Thank you for remembering. Maybe you have a view about the lyrics in the George M. Cohan song that says, "Give my regards to Broadway, remember me to Herald Square, tell all the gang up on 42nd Street that I will soon be there."
Whisper of how I'm yearning to mingle with that old time throng. Yes. One of my favorites.
Do you have a view that maybe reflects the theater district that he was a part of around Herald Square, getting up and moving up to Times Square before it was called Times Square, when it was called 42nd?
That's right. So that was, Give My Regards to Broadway was 1904, I think it was written. So Times Square was still Longacre Square at that point, about to become Times Square. I think what that refers to, it's interesting that he talks about Herald Square, because Herald Square at that point was still the main theater district. And that the play that song came from, Little Johnny Jones, was put on at the Herald Square Theater, I believe. Theater at Herald Square. So that song really was about Herald Square. But the reference to 42nd Street, I think what he's talking about is the rivalry on 42nd Street between, on the south side of the street, Claw and Erlanger and the Theatrical Syndicate, and on the north side of the street, the Schuberts, David Belasco. So they were at odds with each other. So 42nd Street was considered like a dividing line. So I think he was maybe referring to that rivalry.
And so that, I think, is the same thing that you were saying about when you were writing it, and then it was published, and you wish you had written something before. Euripides might have written something and said, time. And today they quote him in all of these classes with the wrong thing that he meant to change.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I'm not Euripides, though. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, when you walk down Broadway now, in the sidewalk, they have strips of ticket tape parades in gold. And it's mostly, I think, from the 50s and 60s. Like Suharto coming from Indonesia.
They have them
and
all.
some crane.
They have all of the ones.
Pinnacle. I don't know what years those things go from. But it's not recent and it's not old. So maybe the 50s and 60s.
If you go down far enough, it curls around by the old customs house, and you get the very first ones.
Oh, it starts at the customs.
Uh-huh.
And it goes up to like Chambers Street.
It starts in 1886.
Yeah,
And goes up to Chambers Street.
right. They missed a few, though. They don't have everyone. They don't have the...
But they're so weird what they're for. Like some mayor of Cincinnati came to town or something like that.
So what that was about, which I also found out since the book came out, from the Manhattan Borough president, Manhattan Borough historian, whose name eludes me. Nice name.
Was shown.
Yes, sorry. So he filled me in on that. So the deal with that was that, yeah, everybody who came, the Crown Prince of Sweden, whatever, they all got a ticker tape parade, and they all got like the key to the city, and it was a political thing. Like they kind of gave them these door prizes for coming to the city, especially during the Cold War. It was really kind of a way of sticking it to the Soviet Union.
Yes. So what's next? Are you going to take it all the way up to Albany in a sequel?
Oh God.
Or just the bone.
No, that's it. Yeah, I was originally going to it was going to be all the way up to Albany. That was too drastic. Then it was going to be the 18 miles, I think, through the Bronx. And I just ran out of time. So no disrespect to the Bronx. Yes, sir.
Broadway versus the Bowery. Some people feel that, starting as a Native American trail, the Bowery is older. Others feel it's the route of Broadway. Do you have an opinion?
Which is older? I don't think anybody knows. I think the Bowery was, maybe it was a reused Indian trail, maybe not. It was definitely used by the Dutch as a way to get to their farms, hence the name Bowery. Bowery was Dutch for farm. But the section north of Broadway, north of City Hall Park, it was certainly surveyed during the colonial era. I found the surveying records, so there was nothing there before. So if I had to guess, I would say probably the Bowery. And the Bowery and Broadway have a really interesting social relationship. And at one point I wrote a lot about that, but my editor said, "This is becoming a history of the Bowery. What are you doing?" So, but there's definitely an interesting relationship between the two streets.
In a nutshell?
Sorry?
In a nutshell, the relationship? Can you do it?
Yes. That they were really, well, the Bowery was more important because it was the only way to get out of town. So it developed before Broadway, that part of Broadway. And then it wasn't until the early 19th century that Broadway continued all the way north past 10th Street. So at that point, then they were, for the next century, they were neck and neck. They both had the stores, they both had the hotels, they both had the theaters. And then, but because then Broadway sutured itself to other streets, it became the long street, and the Bowery gradually, very gradually, became the kind of evil twin.
How about that curve at 11th Street?
At 10th Street,
Oh, yeah, why it happened?
the jog,
Yeah.
do you all know about this? If you're walking north, you get to Grace Church, suddenly Broadway suddenly swerves, and it's straight, and then it cuts to the north. Yeah, I was really curious about that. So the reason that happened is that they wanted to extend Broadway to meet the Bowery. And in doing that, they were going through land that was owned by three of the most prominent landowners in the city, a merchant, a judge, and somebody else, who just said no. So they had to go around it. That's the short answer.
And why there's no 11th Street? Because of the Brevoort's shade tree.
Because what?
There's no 11th Street because, at that juncture, because Henry Brevoort's favorite shade tree was right there, and he fought tooth and nail against the street grid. And
Yeah, so there's a lot of different variations of that story. So the tree is one, another one has a tavern,
Okay.
but his house was right in the middle of, right in the planned extension of 11th. It was his house that he was trying to save. Plus he was a horticulturalist and he had fruit trees, so it was probably an entire orchard that he was trying to save. And he succeeded in doing that, and his son as well, and 11th was never put through.
That building downtown on Washington, I think, you know where it starts, is that the Kennard building also? Is that the same?
It's not the same. I think the Kennard is number 3 or 5 or something like
No,
that.
25.
25.
Okay.
The Washington building is still there now. It's called the Merchant, what is it, the Marine something, International Marine Company building.
Okay.
One more. maybe?
So when the Broadway subway was put in, did they dig up Broadway or did they tunnel under it?
They dug it up disastrously. Totally destroyed the street for a couple of years, yeah. Yeah, it was an open channel. It's right underneath the street, the subway there.
Does your book mention early sidewalks of Broadway? Because I'm thinking of those gigantic bluestones that came from the Palisades that are so elegant, but they're just very impractical. Predates concrete, I guess, right? So it's,
Yeah, I don't exactly know what era those are from. I'm curious about that too. Those huge bluestone pieces, the ones that include the curb, are just amazing. Yeah. Do you know anything about them? I don't really know anything.
well, it's a high labor issue,
Yeah.
but then labor didn't cost anything back then.
Right.
Where are they exactly?
Oh, they're all over, I guess, yeah, building area.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Hi, welcome. How many of you are here for the first time tonight? Anybody? Well, there you go. So Fran's fans, I guess. You can let me know later how you found out about it. It wasn't directly from Fran. For the new people, I'm Carol Willis. I'm the founder, director, and curator of the museum. And when you haven't been here before, you may not know that we've been in this space since 2004. So we're going on our 14th year. And we love our monthly series of authors' talks about all topics that have to do with either New York skyscrapers, urbanism. As a matter of fact, our next one's going to be on public art in New York, so especially New York City history. These are all topics that we like to explore. explore and exploit, I might say, our many friends and colleagues who produce books on New York, and Fran Leadon falls into that category. He's been a friend of the museum in doing participating programs that we've had, and it's really a delight tonight to be able to introduce him and this book that I'm sure you've all been seeing around, Broadway, A History of New York in 13 Miles, which is a really nice concept for thinking about how to unwind the story of Broadway. Broadway is so rich a subject, and it's extraordinary that Fran he's just been telling me, spent like only 8 years in producing this book. A lot of us have worked a lot longer on even shorter books than 8 years, but it's a topic that you could spend your whole life on, because in every way, in social, economic, architectural, political, Broadway plays out so many different narratives that are central to the history of New York. And this is a delightfully well-written book, and I encourage you to, certainly buy a copy, which we'll have the opportunity to do after the talk. We have books over here on the side. You can buy one in the store and have Fran write a dedication to you. It's a book, it's a narrative that reminds me a lot of the storytelling that Rick Burns and James Sanders, I think particularly James Sanders, who writes about the history of film and happens to be one of the board members of the Skyscraper Museum, but he's also an architect, as Fran is, and a teacher, and Fran teaches at City College. And somebody who is really steeped in the history of New York, but also likes to engage people in those stories through really strong narratives. So that is an uncommon talent to have, being a historian and writing well, but it's well displayed by Fran. And so I'm going to get out of the way and let him regale you with some of these stories of Broadway, but not until I mention the other major project that he's been engaged in for these almost decades now, the AIA Guide to New York, so the Guide to the Architecture of New York City, that's produced in the series that was started by
Elliot
Walensky, yeah.
Norval White.
Yeah, right, and Norval White, almost 30 years ago now?
Oh, no, 60s. They started 68.
Okay, 50 years ago started the tradition, and Fran is now carrying it on, having been taken on as a co-author with Norval White after the death of Elliot Walensky. So he's somebody who looks hard at architecture, who thinks about it and writes about it, and so I'm delighted to introduce Fran to you tonight.